pleasure to finally get here and to find that the stories they say about the Jaipur Literary Festival are true. It is a most extraordinary buzzing phenomenon and of particular pleasure to me, having, yes, I've done quite a few literary festivals in the UK and so on, is to see young people. And not only that, but also to see young people who ask questions. So it is a great thrill for me to be here. And Anita, it is bizarre when you look at the phenomenon of Ashoka, the king without sorrow, how his name is obliterated from Indian history. And it's not until really the beginning of the 20th century that he becomes known within India. And it is a sad story. So I don't want to mislead you. My book is not a biography of Ashoka. That really is the job of the specialist and the archaeologist and the Indian historian, because so much is still going on. The rediscovery of Ashoka continues apace, particularly down in Karnataka, where exciting discoveries are being made to this day. But the fact is that he was wiped out of India's history. And that was a puzzle to me.
It might be useful, I mean, especially for the younger people here, just to understand the scale of his influence. I mean, how much territory bowed before Ashoka?
It is astonishing when you think that he is the man who essentially unites India under one government. He is the one who lays down moral principles of government for the first time in world history. He is the guy who actually turns a minor cult into a world religion. It's he and his missionaries, it's he and his particular interest in one particular religion. Not only that, he lays down moral principles for the nation which are secular. I want to stress that. His dharma is secular. He calls for all religions to be respected. Long before Gandhiji, long before the Mahatma, he was calling for ahimsa as a policy, as a national policy. He is, yes, he's a vegetarian, but as I say, he has all these, he is, to put it crudely, the first guy who comes along and says, make love, not war. And it is tragic that that is not yet fully understood within India. There was a famous prime minister who did understand it, but it worries me now that Ashoka is perhaps being re-forgotten.
Well, let's put that to rights now. So right at the beginning, as you say, those who even have a slight cognizance of the name, they will associate Ashoka with that ahimsa, the peace, the wisdom, all of those things. And yet, here is a man who was steeped in blood. Let's not forget, I mean, you don't get a territory as big as his, which, I mean, somebody's described it as engulfing the whole of the subcontinent just minus the southern tip. You don't get that through playing nice, do you? And he didn't play nice at the beginning.
Somebody said to me, oh, it's easy to be a pacifist when you've destroyed all your enemies. And that is true of Ashoka. There are two Ashokas. I'm sure those of you who've seen that great and good man, Shah Rukh Khan, doing his Ashoka will perhaps have got a slightly false opinion of the guy. But what is true is that he is two personalities in one body. He begins as Kanda Ashoka. He is angry Ashoka. He is the youngest child of an emperor who dislikes him. He has some sort of skin condition. He is rejected from the court. He has 100 brothers ahead of him, and he has no authority or no chance of becoming the ruler. And the chances are indeed, with the hostility, in the way that things were done in those days, that he will be destroyed by his brothers. So the chance comes, he takes the chance, he destroys his brothers before they can destroy him. He then sets out an extremely violent early civil war, I would call it. It's very interesting, you see that in some Puranas they say he ruled for 41 years, in some they say he ruled 37. The 4 years are essentially the interregnum, a 4-year civil war of blood and horror. And that culminates with his attack on what we now call Orissa. But until very recently, it was still, my brain has gone completely blank.
Kalinga?
Kalinga. I'm sorry, this happens to me more and more frequently. I do apologize. Kalinga, that name stayed for Orissa really until quite modern times. And Kalinga, of course, is, there is a river there called Daya to this day. And that is where the great destruction of the Kalingans took place. But what is so astonishing is that you have an emperor who, within 2 years of Kalinga, stands up and said, I have made a most appalling mistake. I am so sorry for what I have done. I have killed so many thousands. I have enslaved so many thousands. I have cremated so many widows and children without parents. And I have enslaved so many people. I'm so sorry. I'm going to put it right. My God, has any politician or king ever done that? Said, I'm sorry, and then actually made steps to put it right.
And before we get to the second Ashoka, I mean, just to give the scale, he had a lot to be sorry. I mean, one estimate puts it, 100,000 people were put to death at Kalinga. So this was a man who had no mercy at all when he fought that campaign.
I think it is interesting, if you go down to the south, the furthest of Ashoka's rock edicts, there are various levels of them, is on the southern borders of modern-day Orissa. And there he actually writes up to his neighbors, and he says, neighbors, don't be frightened of me. I am not going to conquer your territory. I will only conquer you by moral force from now on. I will not conquer you by violence. Please don't be alarmed. And it wasn't a trick. He was deliberately saying, no, this far and no further. I'm not. So if you look at the maps of Ashoka, the Ashokan territory, which is larger than India has ever been before or since, in terms of a united India, it does not include the tip. It does, however, reach deep into Afghanistan as far as what we call the Hindu Kush now. So it was a very large territory that was under one rule. And as I say, that almost defines modern India. The sense of nationhood begins at that time.
Before we get to Ashoka II, the revenge, the second phase of Ashoka, you have a very lovely piece in your book which sort of talks about the way in which he strides this sort of where he was everything and where he becomes forgotten. Can I just ask you to read a little? Is that all right?
I always think that readings from books are the kiss of death when people start to read, but if you'll forgive me reading it just a wee bit,
it's very much worth it. It's
if I hear
piece.
people starting to shift and seats, I'll stop. But I'm really going to talk about what I call Ashoka's song, if I might call it that, because I think there is something extraordinarily romantic, which not only I felt, but I know that Jawaharlal Nehru felt it, and I know that people like H.G. Wells felt it. Ashoka's song, the words of what might be called Ashoka's song, more prosaically today referred to as Ashoka's rock and pillar edicts, are inscribed in India's first written script. I never made the point, of course, that he brings in so many innovations. Not only the first written language, if you'll forgive me just excluding Harappan civilization, the first concise and clear and understandable written language, which extends the first modern artwork in stone, the first building in stone, the first sense of shared government, the idea of levels of government that work. I know his grandfather had started this, but he established it. Let me go on. These words of Ashoka, they're chiseled on hundreds, or they were chiseled on hundreds of surfaces, on scores of polished pillars throughout the Indian subcontinent. One of my great pleasures these last 30 years has been going to places like Mansehra, right up in northwest frontier, to Gujarat, and looking at Girnar, going to the south. There's one in Kalsi, just outside Mussoorie. There's a wonderful drawing of an elephant there, and underneath it a mysterious writing which says, "My favorite elephant." And it's one of Ashoka's edicts underneath, but we don't know when he says, my favorite elephant, is he talking about literally my favorite elephant, or is elephant actually a symbol of the Buddha? I was reading, wasn't I? I'm sorry. I was going to talk about these. I won't go on too much, but only a very few of these precious edicts have survived. I won't talk about the reasons why. It's not just human violence. It's also weathering and all the other conditions, earthquakes and so on. And I'm going to move on down. British historians and archaeologists working in India in the 19th century were quick to blame the eclipse of Buddhism in India on Muslim conquest. For 7 centuries, there were zealots from one particular religion who did indeed inflict horrendous human and cultural damage on India in the name of Islam. And if I may, I am talking about some zealots as opposed to an entire religion. Yet the fact is that Buddhism in India was in terminal decline long before Mahmud of Ghazni, who's the first of the terrifying raiders who come into India every summer to rape and pillage and destroy. Already by the 9th century, Buddhism was, as practiced by its adherents in India, had become so esoteric, so isolated from the wider community as to be unable to compete with revitalized devotional Hinduism as promoted by such people as the 9th century reformer Shankaracharya, as you will well know. However, there is another equally important, I would say even more important reason for the failure of Buddhism in India. And it's one, I'm sorry to say, that very few followers of the Hindutva, for instance, will accept. And it is simply Brahminical intolerance, which at times was as unbending in its hatred of heresy and heretics as later Muslims were. It's very hard to explain this now today. I've always been told and understood that Hinduism is religion of peace, but alas, there is evidence. Now, the evidence mostly, I have to say, does come from outside India. It comes from those surviving pockets of Buddhism in places like Nepal, in Tibet, in Burma, in Sri Lanka, and so on. In other words, the surrounding periphery. And you may say that's biased. Within India itself, yes, there is evidence of that Brahminical intolerance. There are texts which demonstrate an implacable hostility towards Buddhists and record their persecution in the hands of Orthodox Hindu rulers. And then, of course, there's also the evidence of archaeology, which is essentially destruction. There is very little of Ashokan archaeology surviving. And yet this is a man who, by Buddhist tradition, extended Buddhist monuments throughout India. I'm not going to say too much more. I'm going to, because I don't think this works terribly well. I'm much better just talking. But I will make one point, because it's about religious intolerance, and it applies to all religions. There are, just to paraphrase, there are a great many famous Hindu temples that have their foundations on Buddhist temples. I picked out a few in the book, and I won't name them. It'll be up to you to have a look if you wish. However, the most striking evidence of Brahmanical hostility towards Buddhism comes in the form of silence, and this is what is so remarkable. The way in which India's Buddhist history, which extended over large parts of the country and lasted for many centuries, was simply excised from the historical record. It is that simple act of omission, the historical revisionism of generations of pious Brahmins who believed that they were dealing with a heresy, and indeed pious genealogists. It is by that means that Ashoka's song was silenced, and Emperor Ashoka almost erased from India's history. You find him only in the Puranas. He's simply one of a list of rulers within the Mauryan dynasty. And the one they're really keen on, the Brahmins, is Chandragupta. And why? Because his counselor was a wonderful and extraordinary statesman called Chanakya Kautilya, extraordinary man. It is a senseless example of a wise Brahmin bringing on a good ruler. I'm just going to read one more para and then leave it at that. Religious tolerance knows no frontiers. When the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan was pulling down Hindu temples in Varanasi, Puritans in England were busy smashing church windows, destroying statues of the Virgin Mary, Christ, and so on, in their zeal to clarify. They were the Taliban of 17th century England. Historians, and this is perhaps the most important thing I've got to say in this whole book, historians who deny or conceal such uncomfortable truths do us no favors. They're not helping themselves or anybody else. And this is part of the reason why I set out to write this book. Thank you for your tolerance. I won't do any more reading.
No, you know what? You read beautifully. You write beautifully, and the tangents actually are a delight. Can I just pick you up on one thing which I'm fascinated with? People want to identify him as almost the prototype Buddhist, the prototype Indian Buddhist, and you really kind of avoid doing that as much as you can in the book. You call him a secularist. You use the word secular. You don't give yourself over to that. Why do you resist it?
I think it's terribly important when you're writing this sort of book, and I wish more people did it as historians. I'm not writing as a Buddhist or as a Hindu or as a Christian or whatever it is. I'm writing about the effect of history. Therefore, I think it's important that I recognize Gautama Sakyamuni, as a great moral philosopher who sets down certain ideas which are revolutionary in their time. And they were undoubtedly revolutionary. You know, he challenges the accepted orthodoxy of the time, and he and his followers have an impact, and we don't know exactly how extensive that impact was, but within 150 years of his death, which again I would place as a historian at about 410 BCE, before the Common Era, and if you're a Buddhist, you'd probably say 6th century or 5th century. I would place his death at 410 BCE, because that's what the historical records tell us in terms of what we've got. The other thing we've got to remember, we're dealing with, yes, I talked about Ashoka and his edicts written in stone. Therefore, writing was being exercised throughout India at the time of Ashoka. Why then have we got no religious edicts? Why have we got no shastras, no sutras, until about the 3rd century AD? In other words, so I must use that term, CE, the Common Era. Why is it the 6 or 7 centuries elapsed from the time when there is writing? And the only answer that I can come up with is that it is sacred text. Not only is it sacred text, but it's also hermetic text. In other words, it's almost a secret. I am a Brahmin. I will pass on my esoteric knowledge to my chela. I am your guru. This is secret teaching almost. I will preserve that. Even within Buddhism, the tradition of oral transmission is a sacred transmission of a sacred text. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, when we look at wonderful great epics like the Mahabharata, and are we talking about a text which stays pristine and pure for 7 centuries of writing down or even longer? Or are we talking about interpolations? Are we talking about additions that happen? You will know that there are very famous texts within India called the Puranas, Vishnu Purana, Matsurya Purana, and so on. And the evidence suggests from various textual comments made within them that none of them are written down until the 3rd or 4th or even 5th century of the Common Era. And yet they prophesy events that are going to take place in the future, in let's say, the 2nd century BCE. So clearly these are written, in fact, written down long time afterwards. So we're talking about very vague things. When the Buddha, when Gautama Sakyamuni dies, what are the first things his disciples do, having cremated him and dispersed his parts, his ashes? They gather together in horror. And now, what exactly was he teaching us? And as you know, there's a famous conference at Rajgir, which dominated by his cousin Ananda, and they set down what you might call an orthodox text, but they don't write it down. What do? They get 100 scholars who say, look, you're the best memories in our group. Come on, guys, you've got to learn this text, you've got to learn this text. And so the oral tradition has lasted. How reliable is that oral transmission? When we look at the actual facts of what Buddha teaches, we can find no reference to gods. We can find no reference to esoteric elements of bodhisattvas and so on. There's this great accretion of material that builds up. When you go back to the first principles, you seem to be dealing with someone whose teaching is essentially extremely simple and unsophisticated. Life is a nightmare. Life is how are we going to deal with life? How are we going to deal with surviving life is really essentially what he teaches. And he has this, as I say, revolutionary teaching. The whole concept, which he sets out in famously, the Noble Truths and so on, which I'm not going to go into. And essentially they're very simple. The 8 rights. How are we actually going to live a good moral life? How are we actually going to get through this business of samsara? How are we going to make ourselves better persons? And in a sense, I want to stick with that. That's an awful long answer. I'm
No,
sorry
no,
if I've
not
gone
at
on
all.
too
But that's kind of fascinating, because as a historian, you need clues. You need things that are either written in the sand or the stone or on paper. So how do you go about tracing back and making this person real when, you know, he's barely even a shadow, actually, when you look at what's left?
What is so wonderful about Ashoka is that he is the first man in Asian history to give us some idea of what a personality he was like, because he actually sets it down in stone. We get a very interesting picture. When you look at those edicts, go back and actually look at translations of these edicts and actually work your way through it. And you think some of them are absolutely bizarre. He says, well, I don't want you to eat this duck or that peacock or this species of this or this. And then on the other hand, he's saying, what is Dharma? What is my law? And he actually sets it down very simply. Can I read it, Pastor?
Yeah, please.
So on the one hand, and I imagine here, can you imagine, he has perhaps a very few scribes who can actually, somebody has got together and invented a beautiful written script, which is Prakrit put into Brahmi. Some genius came up with this, the mother and father of most of Indian languages. You know, the Brahmi writing evolves into the Gupta Brahmi, which evolves into Devanagari, and that is only one of the many forms of this. It's the mother and father of the Asian languages, this wonderful Brahmi script. I'm sorry, I'm talking about script now, not language, the actual written word. And so when we read it, we get a very clear image of this guy, and that gives the historians an awful lot of wonderful stuff to work with. Let me read you, if I may, just a few lines. Nowhere, except in his very early edicts, does he promote Buddhism. I want to stress this. His major edicts, which are written on the great columns and written on the large boulders shaped like elephants, he never mentions Buddhism. He says, I am promoting my Dharma, my moral law. What is Dharma, he says? And it's remarkable. It's not about sacrifices or prayers or being a good religionist. What is Dharma? It is little evil, much good, kindness, generosity, truthfulness and purity, much self-examination, much respect, much fear of evil, and much enthusiasm. And essentially, that is the Dharma he promotes. Being a nice guy, being good to your mother and father, respecting people, respecting other religions. And yet, you still have this image of a tyrannical, extremely powerful ruler who is marching up and down in one of his palaces. There's a terrified scribe, and part of him is coming up with gibberish. Some of his, either that or the guys who were so terrified they didn't get it right, and presumably they only got the one go. And it's not as if he could write it down and say, you know, make some notes. He almost certainly was illiterate, but his scribes were not. And so you get this wonderful mix of really good sense and gibberish. And I find that really very human in a way.
Well, you do make him, I mean, the way you speak, you make him sound like the original hippie. I mean, it is that kind of, you know, be nice to each other.
Yes, I don't want you to think that.
No,
actually,
I wouldn't put that on the back of the book. But just from your point of view as a historian, though, sort of laying hands, because you have done this, you found original texts, in your search to sort of flesh out the subjects for your books, you go in search of stuff that no other human has touched before, read before. I mean, I'm sort of thinking about, you know, you discovering the Kapilavastu and things like that. I mean, these are extraordinary things. I just wonder what actually happens to you as a human being, Charles, when you suddenly hold in your hand that which has not been held before.
I wonder if I'd share with you, but you're not to tell anybody else. I don't mean that. But I hope that, but if there's a press person in this room, please don't publish the name of this place. There is one particular site. It's set in the jungle, in some mountains, in the middle of central India. It's called Pangararia. All right. And to go there is to feel the presence of Ashoka, because two things have happened there. It's a very early lost Buddhist monastic site. In the days when Buddhists who actually took up the order, who actually became monks, bhikkhu, bhikshu, when they actually took up the order, they had renounced society and they went off to live in the wild, and they lived in rock shelters, away from civilization. And the very first tranche of edicts that he puts out are specifically for these isolated Buddhist monastic communities. And that's the place where he says, I am, after 2.5 years, I have become an upasakya. I have become a follower of Sakyamuni. And he says, I have entered the Sangha. I have joined the Buddhist church. It's the only place he does it. And then he goes on to say, that's where he first starts to lay out some moral precepts. Those are intended precisely for the Buddhist community.
And do you remember that time when you first entered there and touched it and saw it?
wonder if
Do
I
you
might-
get emotional about it? And
Yeah, I think but what is more exciting, and this is the only place in India, first of all, you're looking at writing which is almost the earliest examples of writing in India. And it's pretty crude, it's not as organized. You know, many of you, I'm sure, will have been to Feroz Shah's Lat, outside the Feroz Shah's Kotla. And there you will see very sophisticated Brahmi. But you go to this little place, you see and there are mistakes. But above it, he has added something. It wasn't chipped away with a chisel. And again, it's been very crudely tapped in, probably with a hammer, and it's hardly visible. This was only discovered in 1971, when people were, some local anthropologists were looking at rock caves and rock paintings. Above it, he's written, I Piyadasi, because that is the name he takes when he becomes king. Devanama Piya Piyadasi. Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, one who confers blessings. That's his regnal name. When I was a prince, I came here with my consort. What he's saying here is that Ashoka was here. It's a graffiti. Ashoka has written up some personal comment, and those of you who will know the Buddhist story, Ashoka is saying, when I was a prince, I came here with my girlfriend, and that girlfriend is almost certainly the mother of his 2 Buddhist children. That is almost certainly, because this is quite near, I'm giving the game away, not far from Sanchi. And as you know, Sanchi is at Vidisha, and Vidisha is where his first, so far as we know, his first wife comes from, and she is a Buddhist. And their 2 children, he seems to have abandoned her later on, but then he seems to have rediscovered her or re-met her, because their 2 children, they're huge within the story of the arrival of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. It is my brain's gone blank again, Mahendra, who goes, or Mahindo if you prefer it, who leads a delegation of missionaries from Sanchi down to, and brings the word of Buddhism. And indeed, Sangamita, the daughter, she goes out to take the Ashoka tree, a little cutting from the Ashoka tree, and plants it in Anuradhapura. So, in a sense, there's that wonderful little glimpse you have of the real man coming back, and perhaps I like to think remembering that happy time when he had no great responsibilities, when he was being treated very badly by his father. Mind you, his father had made him viceroy of Ujjain. He had some rule. I'm getting boring, so I can just...
Not at all. No, you're not getting boring at all. In fact, you've answered the question, in the most beautiful way. It is exciting to see that thing for the first time. It's thrilling, and you get close to the man. I mean, in a way, and I know I said this to you, and you kind of almost buried yourself in the carpet, but you're as close as we get to an Indiana Jones, in that you are going into caves and into dust and into dirt, and you're scrabbling around, and you're shining a light on, old graffiti. How much more is there out there to find? That's what I wonder. How many more some of these young people can go out there and do what you've done, Charles?
There are surviving, so far as we know, 21 of the lesser, more minor rock edicts. One was discovered last year, which is thrilling, 100 miles northwest of Varanasi. And it copies the others. It says that I became an upasake, I became a follower of the Buddha. And they're that first generation. So it's still happening. Now, I don't know what to say about we have an institution in this country called the Archaeological Survey of India, which does many good things.
But
I am so jealous. I come from a country where if you're an archaeologist, you look for the signs of a post hole in the ground. In other words, where a bit of wood has rotted away and has left slightly more acidic looking soil. It's a brown circle. Oh, there's an Iron Age hut here. And I come to this country and I see the treasures you've got, and I see the way you look after some of those treasures, and it makes me furious. No, I'm being a bit unfair here, because how the hell does an Archaeological Survey of India, a big organization, look after so many sites? It has a limited budget.
You start by building a fence around things. I mean, that's something we discussed, that, one of the only things that we've got, I come from Britain as well, we have Stonehenge. We built a fence around it just so that people can't go and sort of, pee up against it.
I was going to say, what you do is you go to a particular site, and after much difficulty, you find a famous rock edict, and look, wonderful boulders, and you can see where it was, because you've looked at a 19th century picture, you've seen this great elephantine boulder, and there's no doubt that Ashoka deliberately selected huge elephant-looking rocks for his rock edicts. And then what do you see now? You see a kind of thing that looks like a public urinal has been placed over it. A sort of concrete cell with bars has been placed on it, and that is how the ASI preserves these monuments. So what do people do? They go outside and they throw stones through the bars. I'm going to pick out one more example, if I may, because it makes me hopping mad. Look what's happening at Feroz Shah's Lat. Now, here is one of the great monuments of Delhi, for heaven's sake, and the earliest monument of Delhi. And there it stands on the grounds of, as a Feroz Shah's Kot. And what is happening to it? Go up there and have a look, particularly on a Thursday. Now, the lower section of that, which is surrounded by an iron barricade, what happens is that on Thursdays, people put their hands through with black ink and they mark it. So the beautiful, beautiful, polished, this secret that we still don't know how Ashoka's engineers created this wonderful polish that has survived these 2,300 years. That polish is now being worn away, and the pillar, I'm not joking, goes like this. It is being worn away at the bottom by thousands of Muslim pilgrims. Because that site is not being protected. I don't blame the pilgrims. They have, in this wonderful way that syncretic religion, if it's allowed to, takes place, it has now become a Muslim shrine. And all around it, you will go there and you will see very devout Muslims. There are no images, but in each of the alcoves of Feroz Shah's Kotla, you will see candles lit, and you will see offerings being made to the boots, in fact, to the jinns. But that shouldn't be allowed to happen. It's too important for India that in this instance one particular religion should have actually taken it over. And somebody should have the guts to actually control access to it in a way that doesn't destroy the monument. Now that, to me, is very sad. Having said that, I'm so glad the ASI is here, but God, they don't half keep their secrets.
Yeah, I can see so many people nodding their heads when you were saying that, and I think people, we're going to open it up to questions in just a moment. Just before we do, just give me an idea of where people are on the mics, if you could get to people already. Put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question of Charles, and let's just get the mics to them. There's one lady at the front who's over here. Just while you're getting the microphone to people, you know Edward Said, the historian, you know what's coming. He said that he described British historians, like you, as the dead white men in periwigs.
We are the dwimps of history.
How do you respond to something like that? That actually, sort of the West comes in, flies in, tells us how to look after our monuments, tells us, where our scripts are. How do you respond to that?
Well, apparently there are people who accept that thesis that I have no business. I don't know if my dear friend Patrick French is in here. I can't see Patrick, but Patrick said he wanted to throw my book out of the window because of a train window. He was in a train. Because I had talked a lot about the role of Orientalists in it. I am a great defender of the Orientalists in India because I think without them, I think Orientalism is based on the age of reason, the idea that science and advancement of civilization takes place by questioning authority, by standing on the basis of knowledge and reason and not on the basis of superstition or what your king tells you. You challenge everything until its value, its authority has been... And people like Sir William Jones, who came out in 1783 and established the Asiatic Society, came out here with a burning zeal to find out about Asia. That was he set himself, I'm here for 10 years, I'm a high court judge. On the one hand, he's a bad Orientalist. His job is to spread English law to India. On the other hand, he wants to discover Asia and spread that knowledge to the world. And it's thanks to Sir William Jones and his first translations of some of the great and wonderful, I mean, he compares this hidden knowledge, all the sacred texts that the Brahmins had kept to themselves, through the secret language of Sanskrit, which no outsider, not even any other low-caste Hindu could have access to. He breaks that seal, and this knowledge becomes available. And through that, German scholars and French scholars who have no, you might say, imperial objective, they're not out to control and redraw India on the British lines. They have a huge excitement about India's culture, and surely we should admire these people and honor what they did here. Some of them were hopeless archaeologists and did a lot of damage, but I do think we should honor the Orientalists and not throw dirt on them, which is what Edward Said did. I know he was a wonderful and valiant Palestinian and so on, but by God, he did a lot of damage with his book Orientalism.
Let's take questions. So who has the microphone? Who has the conch? Okay, if you start with that gentleman there with the yellow. There we are. And there's a lady, if you get the second mic, why don't you just get the second mic to the lady over here and then she can be ready. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Well, we know the ancestors of Ashoka, as in Chandragupta, were under the influence of Chanakya. And first Hinduism was the religion they were following, and then what I know, Jainism was followed by Chandragupta. What do you think inspired Ashoka to follow Buddhism?
I think it's a brilliant question because it is the essence of what this is about. Yes, you're quite right. I mean, there's no doubt that under Chanakya, Chandragupta is essentially a good follower of the Brahmins. I mean, the Brahmins dominated his court. The Brahmins had all the jobs, even the military jobs, to my surprise. The Brahmins are the great thinkers of India, and they have contributed massively to learning. I mean, think of astrology and mathematics and all the other great works of science that Brahmins have. On the other hand, they're the greatest clothes shop in history, if you know your unionism, in the sense that you could only be born a Brahmin. It is interesting, and I wish this point had made earlier. The Buddha devotes a whole chapter in his Dhammapada to what is a Brahmin. What is a Brahmin? He asks again and again and again. He says, you're not born a Brahmin, you become a Brahmin. You become a Brahmin not by sacrifice, not by prayers, not by rituals. You become a Brahmin by the way you live and how you think. And therefore, yes, Ashoka, and indeed Buddhism too, Buddhism asks people to honor the Brahmins. But within the Buddhist context, and I also think within the Ashokan context, when he asks people to honor the Brahmins, he asks people who have actually become closer to the state of Brahma. I hope that is clear. In other words, an elevated state of consciousness by piety and so on. I'm sorry, the question was, yes, sorry. I'm sorry, this is, you know, authors, the problem is we sit in our rooms for a couple of years, and every 2 years we're let out to talk to people. I didn't ask his second, how does he, well, I think there is remorse, but if we look at the datings of various things, as far as we can work them out, he appears to have become a convert to Buddhism at least 2 years before he invades Kalinga. So in other words, he's going there as a nominal Buddhist, and then, presumably, it kicks in, and he realizes what a dreadful thing he's done. And that's when he puts up his first edicts to the Buddhist church, those lesser rock edicts. Then he becomes braver and he starts to put out his universal religion, I would call it, his moral precepts, Ashoka's Dharma, which is different from Buddhist Dharma.
Let's try and squeeze in as many questions. So let's get that lady and then that gentleman there. If you just get the microphone to him. Just here, if you put your hand up, sir, then we'll get, yes, first of all yourself, yeah.
I just wanted to share a couple of experiences and then ask a question. You know, the way we treat, I'm right here. Yeah. The way we treat our heritage is like abominable. I mean, I come from Patna and I've seen Kumrahar is non-existent and that was the capital. When the old British Dak Bangla, which was a heritage thing in its own right, I mean it was a couple centuries old, that was being broken down to make a shopping complex and they discovered Mauryan remains. And they said, what do we do with all this? Too much already. So a lot of that was simply chucked. I think some bits and pieces did get to a couple of museums, but a lot was just simply thrown, and these were actually Mauryan remains. Patna Museum has no explanations worth the name for anything.
Now that you've depressed us, please, just,
Yeah,
do
I
ask
just
a
make it
question.
very short.
Yeah, very
Yeah, I'm coming to the
please.
question.
Thank you, please.
Same. My question is that what can the ASI do given its limited funding? What kind of advice would you have for the ASI to provide adequate protection for these sites?
Thank you very much.
We come back again to political will, do we not? It's not the ASI's fault in a sense. I'm just reminding me, Pataliputra, my God, the city of flowers, the cities where Greek ambassadors came and said, this is amazing city in the middle of India, you know, which is vast and full of palaces and things. My God, yeah, underneath Patna, a lot of it we suspect has been washed away. Nevertheless, every so often, the most wonderful things, you know, the Didaganj Yakshi, for heaven's sake. My God, what a work of art, which outstrips the Venus de Milo. I mean, the Venus de Milo is a caricature compared with the Didaganj Yakshi. That Ashokan sheen still, and that sexy woman with her little folds in her tum, you know, they've even put little folds in her tum. She hasn't followed the weight, you know, the Weight Watchers. But so marvelous. Discovered by accident. But let's remember, however, that what the railway that the British built went straight over the palace. What we think is probably where Ashoka's palace was. Now the counts, and yet the first great modern building in India, as you say, Kumrahar, well, we know it was horrifyingly damaged. We know it was burnt down, almost certainly deliberately, because each pillar, where there was a pillar, has burnt with such a fierce heat that stones, pyres must have been placed around every pillar to destroy this vast 80-pillar hall, which is like something out of Persepolis. You know, the first great modern pillared structure in India was burnt down with, no one's quite sure. My own guess is that it's actually almost certainly Shunga. We know that Pushyamitra Shunga, who overthrows the last of the Mauryas in 185 BCE, we know that he set on an anti-Buddhist pogrom, and he destroyed an awful lot of sites. But what can you do? I think you have to have local political will. This is the problem. May I ask, how many people have heard of Kanagalahalli? Kanagalahalli?
Nobody, not one hand.
I mean, everyone has heard of Sanchi, they've heard of Amaravati and the tragedy of Amaravati, and what little survives has been saved, thank God. You've heard of Bharut and the wonderful sculptures from Bharut, but who's heard of the wonderful sculptures from Kanagali? The ASI has one person.
You've heard of it, oh.
Has sat on that site for 20 years.
Right.
20 years, most wonderful sculptures.
Charles, let's get a couple more, because there's so many people who want to ask questions. So that gentleman there, and then let's get one from the back, because you've often neglected afterwards. Yes, yourself first.
I wonder if you've been privy to the rock edict from Bairat, which is probably collecting dust in Calcutta Museum. Have you had the chance to have a look?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it either.
The mic is not very good. The mic is not very good.
Yeah.
Okay. I said I wondered if you. I'll hold it.
Okay.
If you don't mind. I wonder if you've been privy to the rock edict from Bairat, which is 60 kilometers north of Jaipur. The edict is now. It was taken away by Cunningham, and it's apparently collecting dust in the Calcutta Museum, but it's apparently a very special one. I just wondered if you
Barut.
Do you know
So
about
I
it?
think you're talking
Yeah.
about Barut.
No, no, not Beirut. I'm talking about Bayrat, which
Bayrat,
is
it's
very
near-
close to Jaipur. It was carved out.
Sorry, yes,
Yeah.
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 Indeed, almost the first of the minor rock edicts to be discovered. What's so interesting is that so many of these are hidden in caves. And there's one sanity on the road from Varanasi to Gaya, and you can't go there because some local Muslim in the last 20 years has declared it to be underneath the shrine of a pir, and therefore you cannot gain access to it. And the Ashokan edict has been whitewashed over, and that should not be allowed to happen. Again, to come back to our friends, the ASI.
My question continues. I haven't read your book yet. I have read the other one, Buddha and the Sahibs. Now, my question is, I have been given to believe that it is in that edict that Ashoka mentions that he has joined the order after 280 some days of meditation at Bayrat. And it follows further from there. My final thing is, it's, this business of joining the order has in past, I haven't read your book yet. In the past, British authors seem to believe that that means he's joined the order of the Buddhist monks.
Yeah.
Because the Sangha is normally considered to be the Buddhist monks.
So what do you want to know? Okay, we've got the point.
I
Thank you,
absolutely
sir.
get your point.
Thank you.
I think it's the phrase.
I haven't asked my question.
No, we need to move on. You've had quite a lot of time, so let him respond, and then we'll go to that young lady there. Thank you.
Just very, very quickly, because I think you're right. I think, like everything, Prakrit or Prakrit as expressed in Brahmi obviously has limitations, and it's a question of what interpretation you put on those words. I think the most literal interpretation of that, not so much Upe Sakya, which nobody doubts, it means follower of Sakya, and Sakya is the name of Sakya. But the other phrase, I have joined the Sangha, I do not think if he was going to become a bhikshu, a monk, or a nun, he would actually have used the word bhikkhu. He becomes a lay Buddhist, and I don't think, this is not like our friend Chandragupta, who abdicates and follows his guru down to Sravana Belgola, and in admiration of his guru, fasts unto death. My goodness, we also need a wonderful book on Chandragupta to be written in an accessible way, not by academics. Some youngster, please go away and write a magical book.
Let's just, I'm going to squeeze in, I'm looking at the lady who's in charge of all our desks. 2 more questions we got? Okay, lovely. Well, let's go to that. Have you got the mic already? We'll go to you, and the last question will be from the gentleman in the middle. Yes, okay. Please.
Sir, I am a second-year history student.
Do you want to stand up? It'll be better. We can see who you are. Thank you.
Yeah, and you saying that a book should be written on Chandragupta Maurya. There's already one book by Ramana Thapar on Chandragupta Maurya.
Okay.
Yes and no.
You made some sarcastic comments on the ASI, and since I'm a history student and I have, in a sense, interacted with some of the people from ASI, I've realized that it is not the fault of ASI in general, but the government of India who's not funding it. Just a second. Who's not funding the ASI properly. They are like the second cousins always asking for money. So, and, a general, let's say, disregard for heritage in general by the general public as well. Like people are uneducated, and even the educated people go to monuments scribbling love messages on the monuments.
Do you have a question, please?
Yeah, and my question is that I want you to elaborate on the term Maurya, since the Puranas called the Mauryans as being of low caste origin, and the Buddhists low caste origin, and whereas the Buddhist texts talk about the Mauryas of being of higher origin.
Okay.
The whole point of Buddhism is...
I think that's fine. So let's dwell with the caste thing. Sorry, because we're going to be turfed out in a moment. So yes,
The first point, I cannot agree with you more. I'm damning an organization which, to be fair, has got the most hideous political restraints. But I am going to make one point. You're given money to excavate. You're not given money to publish. If only the two elements were locked together, so that you're not given the money until you damn well publish, the world would know more about what you're doing. and that's not just me saying it, a number of academics in America and India and the States have been saying this. Don't give money to people to excavate and then you die and nobody knows what the hell you've done. It's tragic. But the second point, just to come back to Chandragupta, let's go back to Sakyamuni, for instance. Sakyamuni's, for his mother and his father come, as you know, the Sakyas and the Kolyas, they practice endogamy. Now, endogamy is outside the Buddhist, the Hindu caste system. Therefore, almost certainly, he was not a Kshatriya. And I think exactly the same applies to Chandragupta. We simply don't quite know, but there's, obviously the Buddhists build up wonderful stories that he must be a Kshatriya because only Kshatriyas can rule. And yet there are contradictory stories that he comes from a Maurya. You know, the Mauryas, his family keep peacocks, or whatever it is. My own theory is that actually he almost certainly comes from the northwest country. He comes from a group of people called I won't go into it, but the horse cavalry tribe occupying the territory that now we would give to Swat, that sort of area. And that is why Chandragupta plays. So yes, he's almost certainly not Kshatriya.
Okay. Let's just, the final question, and if so, if you wouldn't mind, just, if you do have other questions, I'm sure, Charles, are you going to be signing books somewhere? Because have you got time to do that? Because then people can, wonderful. So there's the bookshop. I really do urge you, get the book, and then maybe Charles will have a chat with you afterwards if he has the chance. Last question, if you can make it a short one, please, sir.
Very short, yeah. I'm not a historian, but I'm a scholar of international relations. So the point I want to make is, the year or the century Nalanda was destroyed was the century that Oxford came up, actually, around the same century. And so we are back to the theory of realpolitik versus idealist. Ashoka was an idealist. On the whole, do you think that theory will work now for the world?
Thank you.
Let's look at kingdoms or any countries where they tried to rule by pacifism. I'm even thinking of Nehru and Hindi Chini Bye Bye. You know, it didn't work for Nehru, and it certainly didn't work for Ashoka. And there's no doubt that his enemies, his relatives even, in fact, the end of Ashoka is a tragedy. If you look at the main Buddhist texts we've got, which is the Ashoka Vardhana within the Sanskrit tradition, and Mahavamsa, which draws on an earlier text, almost certainly the earliest written down, Dipavamsa in Sri Lanka, they simply gloss over the end of Ashoka's life. Here is a man who becomes a Chakravartin, you know. Something goes horribly wrong towards the end of his career. And you can read there a palace putsch that, in fact, the Brahmins had had enough. Ashoka, towards the end of his life, is spending more and more money on the Buddhists. He's actually favoring one religion over another. He's actually going against all his policies. He's trying to transform the landscape of India with his stupa building program. He's spreading the ashes of the Buddha all around India. And that must have been deeply, deeply shocking for the majority of religionists. Now, yes, he transforms Buddhism into a state religion, but in doing so, he destroys himself. And I think that's the awful. Can I come back to one point? You mentioned Professor Romila Thapa, a great historian, and one, as you know, who was much victimized by a certain political party a few years ago. And more or less, I'm not saying she was driven out of India, but more or less forced to sort of look elsewhere and go to America and then come back in triumph, I'm pleased to say, thank God. But there was that worrying time when the whole idea that, but the point I simply want to make, scholars, I'm a writer of history. I am not a pucker historian. There needs to be intermediaries, I think, like people like me who act. I plunder the work of people like Romila Thapa. I plunder it, I put it together, and I hope to try and make it more accessible to the lay reader. And young Indians, I hope more of you will. It's what Willie Dalrymple and I do. We basically plunder other people's work, and then we republish it in more accessible terms. And it's a bit of a shabby trade in a way, but it gives me enormous pleasure, and I hope perhaps some people also get the pleasure from it. So that's how I justify it. Romila Thapa is not very easy, to be honest. She has written about Ashoka and Maurya, but it's not easy. And also there's a lot more stuff happening. Kanagalahari, for instance, has got the most wonderful, wonderful, it's got the first image of Ashoka.
We are running out, we have run out of time, we so run out of time. Can I just say, it's a lovely way to end with that sort of cri de coeur for the young of India. Thank you, Charles, for your
Thank you
passion,
for your patience
for
as
your
well, for
work,
listening to me.
and for everything. Thank you very much for speaking to us now. Thank you very much.
Shiny books, aren't I? Yeah.
On behalf of the organizers, I thank Charles Allen, and I thank Anita Anand, and I thank the audience for being so wonderfully involved. Thank you very much. See you all again tomorrow, and we have some gifts to give as little tokens of our